We're going to go over now how to take a laptop apart. Now, I've taken apart many laptops, and though they differ from model to model, they seem to follow a general theme, and I'm going to go through my procedure for what I believe is the most efficient way to get the laptops apart. And this applies mainly if you have to get down to the motherboard level. The first thing I do is I pull the battery out. You don't want to have any charge in the laptop when you're working on it. Second, I'll start pulling out components one by one. Components that I can get to easily and that will be able to be removed so they're not connected to the motherboard, like the CD drive. And here I'm getting to the RAM. There's one stick in there. You just grab the two ends of the RAM holder and it'll pop up. Sometimes you have to use a device to get in there if it's too tight. And you pull the stick of RAM out. Then you have a wireless card. And wireless cards have that antenna. It's usually a black, gray, or white cord. It just pops right off. And again, the wireless card comes out just like the RAM does. Now we're going to get the hard drive out. And this laptop actually already has the hard drive taken out, but we'll take the cover off. Now what I really want to do is get the screen off, because the screen's going to be in the way. I want to remove it from the equation. To get to the screen in most laptops, you have to take this cover off, and that gives you access to both the keyboard and the screen. I call it the hinge cover plate because it covers the hinges. And the way to get that off is usually to just pry it off, unless it's held in by screws, and that's why I turn the computer over. I'm going to remove any screw that appears like it's directly under the hinge cover plate that could be fastening it on, because I've pried that hinge cover plate off in the past, and sometimes it's screwed in from the bottom and it breaks. So, rule number one, if you have to force anything off of these laptops, stop what you're doing. It's probably going to break. So I just play it safe and remove all the screws that could possibly be holding that hinge cover plate on. And the only way I'll be able to tell is when I go to attempt to take the hinge cover plate off. So just lining it up. I lined up how big that hinge cover plate is, and I'm just removing any screw that's directly under that. And this computer actually has a lot of them. Most computers don't have this many screws directly under the hinge cover plate. And that looks like all of them that could possibly be holding it in. So now we flip it over, open it back up again, and now we attempt to remove the hinge cover plate, knowing that any screw that could possibly be holding it in is removed. And one way to get to it is to push down the keys and pry under the keys, being careful not to damage the keys when you do that. Or if that doesn't work, look for some other entry point, like there was right under the hinge. And then what you have to do is kind of jiggle it, and it'll pop off. Now we have access to the keyboard, and it's going to take the 4 screws off that are holding the keyboard on. Now that hinge cover plate in some computers might have a ribbon cable attached to it, or might be fastened in a different way, but they're all generally about the same. It's kind of snapped in there, sometimes with and sometimes without screws holding it in. And keyboards, sometimes they have screws like they have in this one where I'm pulling them off now. And they always are attached by a wide ribbon cable that you just grab by both ends at the connector and pull it out. Now I'm disconnecting any ribbon cable I see. This is for the touchpad. Because when I take the top plate off of this computer, that ribbon cable is still going to be connected unless I remove it right now. Now I have access to the screen, and this is the LCD cable I'm pulling off now. And these 2 wires here go to the wireless card. You're going to find in a lot of laptops, the wireless antenna go through the computer to the bottom, to the wireless card, all the way up to the top of the screen. So you have to kind of fish it through the computer and pull it back. This way you could get the screen off. If we didn't pull these wires back, we wouldn't be able to remove the screen. And then we'll start removing screws from the hinges on the screen. This particular computer has 3 hinges that go straight down and hold the screen to the base. 1. And they're on pretty tight, which is a good thing. You want these screws to be tight on a computer because these are the ones that are holding the screen on. You don't want the screen to be flapping around. And then we'll pull the screws out of the other side. Now, if you'll notice what I'm doing with the screws after I'm taking them out of the computer, I'm putting them loosely in certain piles so I remember where they go. And we're going to talk more about this at the very end of this video, so don't get too hung up on wondering what screws go back into the computer and what positions. We will address that because that's definitely a big question. Now the screen should come right up after we pull out this last screw. The screen pops right out. Now our objective is to remove the top part of the case from the bottom part of the case so we get to the motherboard. So let's get that ribbon cable unattached. And this computer has a little circuit board here that needs to be removed, which we'll do now. Not all computers have this circuit board. This was where the power buttons are. I'm just going to take a screwdriver and just pop up the side a little bit and the whole plate should come right out. There we go. Now we're going to start removing screws from the top plate. Any screw that we see that appears to be holding the top part of the case to the bottom part of the case. And we're going to do our best to find every one. And we'll know if we missed one because the cases won't come apart. And now we want to turn it over and remove any other screw that appears to be holding the 2 cases together. Now, generally, in most computers, most of these case screws are going to be about the same size, so you might be able to keep them all in the same pile. And you'll see in the case study videos, some laptops have markings next to each screw hole that tells you the size of screw that goes in there, and that makes it really easy for us. This computer doesn't, so we'll have to keep track of the screws with a system. And when it looks like you have all the screws out, try to pry the 2 cases apart. I don't have long nails, but I generally like to use my fingernail and kind of go along the edge. And just find some entry point where there's already a little bit of an opening there, a gap that you can get your nail in and kind of bring it all around and try to get these 2 cases apart. Remember, don't force anything. And it looks like this is being held in by something, so let's check for screws. And yes, I forgot 1 screw on the top part of the case. Let's see what happens once we get that out. It's coming apart much easier now. So, I'm glad that was in the video because I want you guys to know if it looks like it's not coming apart easy, there's probably a screw holding it in somewhere that you missed. Now we have access to the motherboard here. Let's put that off to the side. And we'll attempt to remove the motherboard now from the top part of the case. This big black device here is just the speakers, and that attaches with a connector to the motherboard. Now, certain screws on the motherboard are labeled, and that's what I'm pointing to now. They have letters next to them. Usually there's white arrows, or there could be letters, like on this computer, that's basically telling you what screws you need to remove to get the motherboard off. The motherboard has many screws if you look at it from the top, but you only need to take a few of them off to get the motherboard off. And it's usually marked on the motherboard by white arrows. In this case, it was marked with the letter PA. Now this little piece here is just an extension for the battery. Now we're going to remove all the screws on the motherboard marked with PA. And when it looks like we have them all, try to pull the motherboard out of the case, gently. And you'll start to feel where the pressure is coming from if there's any other screws holding it in. And what this is here is the processor and heatsink and CPU fan. It usually all comes off in one big device and snaps onto the motherboard with a cable there. And if you notice those numbers, 1, 2, 3, right next to the screw holes, that's usually an indicator, and it will be on most laptops, an indicator of what screws hold in the heatsink over the processor, so you don't tighten them all down in the wrong way. It actually is a guide. It helps you as a guide. And again, once you think you have all the screws, just slowly pull up the motherboard. And you'll start to feel it if you missed one. And this should be the last one there. And just kind of jiggle it until it starts to come loose. And pops right out. And that plastic piece I pulled out is just the holder for the PCM-CIA slot. I'm going to lay something down so there's no static electricity on the motherboard when I place it down. That's just an adapter that I pulled off there for the power jack. And let's clean it while we have it out. I always take the opportunity to clean the pieces when I get them out. And I use the paintbrushes for this. You're not going to have too many chances with these laptops where you're going to get down to motherboard level, so take advantage of it while you can and make sure you get it all clean. And since you have the fan out for the processor, blow it out with compressed air. Now let's take the bottom part of the case and clean that off as well. And now, say if you did have to do a motherboard replacement, you got to start putting everything back together again. And I sped this video up because putting it back together is almost identical to taking it apart in reverse order. Put that power adapter back on. Now we're putting the screws all back on the motherboard marked with the letters PA. Put the speakers on, attach them to the motherboard. They just fit right in there, which they usually do. And that's just a battery extender. Make sure you have all the screws on that were originally on the motherboard before you put the black cover back on. And that's twice. I just checked to make sure I had them all back on there, and I do now. So now I can put the cover back on. It'll usually snap right together. And now start putting the screws back in. Now if you notice, these are screws I took out originally because I thought they were holding the hinge cover plate on. But since they're not, I can put them back on now. And then I'll put all the screws back on the top plate, or the top part of the case. Attach the ribbon cable for the touchpad. Looks like I put the wrong side screw in there, so I'm going to take a couple out and put them all back in. Sometimes you got to take a step back before you go forward. Happens to the best of them. Now put the rest of the screws in. Put that circuit board back in that has the power buttons on it, and make sure you attach the ribbon cables. Always attach your ribbon cables when you're putting things back, otherwise you have to take the whole laptop apart again. It's something that you just have to remember to do. You might get the whole thing back together and then realize the keyboard's not working because you forgot to attach the cable back to the motherboard. And we're just putting the screen on now. Now what I'm going to do, if you watch, is take a bigger screwdriver when I'm done tightening these up, because I want a little extra torque on these screws, because I don't want the screen to be flapping around. I want those screws to hold. So I just take a little bigger screwdriver and put a little extra torque into them before I put everything back. Attach the LCD cable, and now we're going to feed the wireless antenna back through the computer the same way it came out. We're going to close it up. Pull the wires through. Might as well throw the wireless card in now just to get those antenna out of the way. And they snap right back on to the little connectors there. Nothing magical about those connectors. They're very easy. Just put the RAM in. Put some remaining screws back on the bottom of the case here. Okay, let's throw the keyboard in. Attach it to the motherboard with the ribbon connector. Attach the 4 screws to hold it on. Put the hinge cover plate back on. CD drive back in. Battery in. Hard drive cover back on. And that is pretty much how you do it. Most laptops are going to follow that pattern. And that's how I do it. Now, how do you keep track of the screws you get out of a computer? This is a big question. A lot of people are afraid about doing this when they start working on laptops. The method I used to do when I started out is I create a pattern right next to the laptop. A pattern identical to the pattern in which the screws are coming out. So if one screw is to the left of another screw, I place it on the table left of that screw. And I sped the tape up here. You'll notice that a pattern starts to form of the bottom of the case. And now I know where each screw goes when I go to put them back. Some people use containers. And they'll say, every screw I take out of the bottom case, I'm going to put in container number 1. So I know that all the screws in container number 1 are used for the bottom case. And then I'll get a second container. And this will be for maybe screws on the top part of the case, or screws holding the keyboard or the screen on. And then when you're down to motherboard level, there's more screws. So you could use another case for that. And that's one way to track what screws go where. I've seen people take plastic bags and lay them down in layers. Anything on the bottom layer goes into that bag. Keyboard layer goes in that bag. The top layer goes in that bag. The motherboard layer goes in that bag. And they layer them on top of each other so they know the order in which they go back. And I've had one listener tell me he creates a diagram of the actual laptop and draws the screw holes in the diagram. And then when he takes each screw out, he just puts it in the picture of the screw hole that he drew, which I think is a pretty clever idea. And same with the motherboard. And he does that for each layer that he has to. Well, that's pretty much all you need to know for now. If you watch the case study videos, you'll see some of these techniques to put in action, and I think then you'll be ready to do it yourself. Good luck.